In the spring of 1796, a little-known Corsican artillery officer sliced through Italy with the force of a storm, toppling thrones and rewriting the rules of empire. Within 6 years, Napoleon Bonaparte turned battlefield shock into a political machine, resurrecting slavery on one continent, plundering ancient secrets in Egypt, and orchestrating a coup that silenced the world's oldest republic. How did he seize the machinery to take on every rival, the kings, the admirals, the revolution itself? And at what cost would the age of empires be changed forever? The answer begins with the rise no one saw coming. Mud clung to boots and cannon wheels as the army of Italy pressed forward in the spring of 1796. At Lodi, Napoleon's advance guard faced a wall of Austrian muskets across the Adda River. The bridge was swept by shot and smoke, but Bonaparte, just 26, strode to the front. Officers hesitated. He seized a flag and shouted for the grenadiers to follow. The charge broke the Austrian line. News of the victory raced through Europe. An unknown Corsican had shattered the myth of Habsburg invincibility in a single day. Arcole came next, and the campaign became a blur of forced marches and sudden attacks. At Arcole, French columns waded waist-deep through flooded fields, drums beating over the roar of musketry. For 3 days in November 1796, the fighting raged along dikes and muddy causeways. Napoleon, hat in hand, rallied his men atop the narrow bridge, bullets snapping past. The Austrians gave way again. By January, at Rivoli, his battered divisions, outnumbered and half-starved, outmaneuvered a larger force. The corps system, his innovation, let each group fight or march independently, then strike as one. Rivoli's slopes were littered with broken regiments. In less than a year, Napoleon's army had captured Mantua, forced Austria to the table, and redrawn the map of northern Italy. The victories were more than military. Each dispatch home was a lesson in myth-making. Paris read of the little corporal who led from the front, the commander who shared his soldiers' bread and slept in their tents. Paintings and pamphlets spread his image, heroic, youthful, almost untouchable. Within months, the Directory in Paris found itself overshadowed by a general whose popularity grew with every letter and every battlefield report. He turned next to the east. In May 1798, a fleet slipped from Toulon carrying 35,000 men and a convoy of scholars and engineers. The target was Egypt, a blow at British trade and the gateway to India. French troops landed in Alexandria, then marched south under the desert sun. Outside Cairo, on July 21, 1798, they faced the Mamluk cavalry at the foot of the pyramids. Napoleon ordered his men into divisional squares, bristling with bayonets and cannon. Waves of horsemen crashed against the walls of French fire. The field was silent by evening. In his bulletin, Napoleon invoked the ancient stones. "Soldiers, 40 centuries look down upon you." Egypt was more than conquest. Savants scoured ruins and tombs, sending crates of antiquities and manuscripts back to France. In the summer of 1799, a French officer discovered a slab of black basalt near the Nile Delta, the Rosetta Stone inscribed in 3 scripts. It would unlock the secrets of hieroglyphs, a treasure for science even as the campaign itself began to unravel. Victories in Italy and Egypt forged more than a reputation. They gave Napoleon the tools and the legend he needed to challenge not just armies, but governments. The age of generals had become the age of Bonaparte. Paris, November 9th, 1799. While the city's streets churned with rumour and uncertainty, a handful of deputies gathered in the shadowed halls of the Council of 500. Soldiers blocked the doors. Inside, Napoleon Bonaparte stood before the assembly, his uniform still dusted with the grime of distant campaigns. He spoke of national crisis, of conspiracies and chaos, his voice rising above the shouts. At his signal, grenadiers swept into the chamber. The Directory was finished. The COU of 18th Brumaire ended the revolution's last experiment with democracy. By nightfall, Bonaparte held the reins of France as first consul. Victory on the battlefield had opened the door, but it was paperwork, decrees, signatures, and the silent machinery of the state that extended his reach across the continent. In the months that followed, he drafted a new constitution and summoned the Council of State. Power no longer flowed from the streets or the clubs, but from a single desk in the Tuileries. Orders were crisp, impersonal, and absolute. A new instrument appeared in every department: the prefect. Appointed directly by Bonaparte, these officials replaced the patchwork of local authorities with a chain of command that ran straight to Paris. Each prefect received a circular, stamped and initialed, outlining their duties: tax collection, conscription, censorship, surveillance. Their instructions left little room for doubt or dissent. By 1802, the system reached from the Pyrenees to the Rhine, from the Channel to the Mediterranean. France became an administrative fortress, its levers pulled by men whose loyalty was measured in reports and statistics, not in revolutionary slogans. The same logic of control extended overseas. The Treaty of Amiens returned lost colonies to French hands, and with them a bitter question: what laws would rule the Sugar Islands? On May 20th, 1802, Bonaparte signed a decree that would haunt his legacy. The law of 30th Floreal, Year 10, restored slavery in the colonies, erasing the abolition proclaimed in 1794. Article by article, the decree revived the old order. It declared that slavery would be maintained in accordance with the laws and regulations in place prior to 1789. The Atlantic trade resumed, and with it, the forced labour of thousands. The Council of State had debated, some members warning of revolt and dishonour, but the sugar lobby prevailed. The government seized 10 years of unchecked authority over colonial regimes, ruling by executive fiat. Implementation was swift and merciless. Troop transports left Brest and Rochefort, carrying soldiers and administrators to enforce the decree. In Guadeloupe, resistance was drowned in blood. In Saint-Domingue, the order would ignite a war of extermination as black and mixed-race populations faced the return of the whip and the chain. Prefects and generals relayed the law from Paris to the tropics, their dispatches terse, their instructions absolute. The tools of empire had changed. Where the revolution had promised liberty and fraternity, the new regime offered order, discipline, and the cold arithmetic of power. Paper and power moved together, circulars and decrees, censuses and conscriptions, forming a machinery capable of mobilizing millions. The state became a weapon as formidable as any cannon, its reach extending from the ministries of Paris to the plantations of the Caribbean. The age of Bonaparte was not just an age of victories, but of systems built to last and to conquer. Dawn on October 21st, 1805, brought a restless Atlantic and a sky heavy with anticipation. 33 Franco-Spanish ships, their sails taut and hulls glinting in the early light, formed a double line off Cape Trafalgar. The Allied fleet stretched nearly 5 miles. A wall of timber and iron braced for battle. On the British side, Admiral Horatio Nelson stood on the quarterdeck of HMS Victory, his one good arm clasped behind his back, eyes fixed on the horizon. 27 ships of the line followed him, their crews silent, waiting for his command. The wind shifted, unpredictable, but Nelson's intent was clear: break the enemy's line, crush their centre, and decide the fate of empires in a single afternoon. At 11:50, flags snapped at Victory's masthead. England expects that every man will do his duty. Nelson's plan was audacious. 2 columns would drive straight at the Allied formation, risking raking fire to split the enemy and sow confusion. As the British closed in, the French flagship Bucentaure braced for impact. Broadsides erupted, thunder rolling across the waves. Cannonballs tore through decks, masts splintered, and the air filled with the roar of battle. Boarding parties clashed in the smoke, cutlasses flashing, pistols cracking at close range. On Redoutable, French Marines perched in the rigging, firing down onto Victory's deck, turning the planks slick with blood. At 1:15, a musket ball found Nelson. It struck his left shoulder, passed through his spine, and left him mortally wounded. He refused to leave the deck, giving orders as the battle raged above. Victory's guns hammered Bucentaure, tearing her apart. By 2 o'clock, the French flagship struck her colours. The Allied line buckled. 19 ships were lost, some sunk, others captured. Over 4,000 men lay dead or taken prisoner. Nelson, carried below, clung to life just long enough to hear that the day was won. His last words, whispered to Captain Hardy, were, "Kiss me, Hardy." The cost was staggering, but the result was absolute. British naval supremacy was no longer in doubt. The Royal Navy's grip on the seas tightened, an iron ring closing around France's ambitions. The wreckage of the Franco-Spanish fleet drifted in the Channel, a warning to any who might challenge British power at sea. Nelson's death transformed him from commander to legend, his tactics studied and revered, his name forever tied to the fate of nations. The sea, once a highway for invasion, became a moat that no enemy would cross for a generation. Even as the Channel filled with shattered hulls and drifting bodies, a different drama unfolded far to the east. In the weeks after Trafalgar, Napoleon's Grande Armée, 73,000 strong, marched relentlessly across Central Europe. The Third Coalition, led by Austria and Russia, believed the French were reeling from their defeat at sea. Their armies converged near Vienna, convinced that Napoleon's luck had run out. But Bonaparte had no intention of retreating. He moved with speed and deception, drawing the Allies into a trap of his own design. December 2nd, 1805. The fields near Austerlitz lay shrouded in mist, the ground frozen and treacherous. Napoleon surveyed the battlefield, noting every rise and hollow. He deliberately weakened his right, inviting the Allies to seize the Pratzen Heights, a low ridge at the center of the field. The move was calculated, a lure. As the sun rose, French lines appeared thin, vulnerable, stretched to the breaking point. The Allies advanced, confident of victory, their columns cresting the Pratzen as Bonaparte watched from below. At his signal, Marshal Soult's corps surged forward. French columns stormed the slopes, bayonets gleaming in the pale light. The attack shattered the Allied centre, splitting their army in two. The battlefield, like the sea at Trafalgar, became a measure of strategy and will, where a single afternoon would decide not just a battle, but the balance of a continent. Russian and Austrian troops, caught off guard, faltered as cavalry swept the flanks and artillery pounded their retreat. On the frozen ponds beneath the heights, chaos reigned. Hundreds of soldiers plunged through cracking ice, drowning as cannonballs skipped across the surface. By nightfall, the coalition's army was broken, with 26,000 casualties and banners trampled in the mud. The Tsar and Emperor Francis fled east, their hopes for victory drowned in blood and ice. Napoleon called Austerlitz the finest of all my battles. Treaties signed at Pressburg soon followed, dissolving the Holy Roman Empire and leaving France the unchallenged master of continental Europe. The contrast was stark. At sea, French power lay in ruins, their fleets shattered and ports blockaded. On land, Napoleon stood at the summit of his genius, his armies moving with a speed and precision Europe had never witnessed. Trafalgar forced France to abandon dreams of invasion, but on the frosted heights of Austerlitz, Bonaparte's star burned brighter than ever. The dual reality of 1805 was set: British mastery of the oceans and French dominance of the continent, a world poised between thunder and silence. November 21st, 1806. The Berlin Decree swept across Europe like a chill wind. Napoleon, now emperor, ordered every port under his control closed to British goods. The British Isles, he declared, were under blockade, not by ships, but by law. No vessel was to carry so much as a bale of English cloth or a barrel of sugar from London. Customs agents, prefects, and prize courts enforced the embargo from Hamburg to Naples, their ledgers swelling with confiscated cargo. The Milan Decree, signed December 17, 1807, tightened the noose. Any neutral ship that touched a British port or paid a British tariff was fair game for seizure. In theory, the continental system would starve Britain of gold, break her merchants, and force the island nation to its knees. In practice, the blockade became a war of attrition against Europe itself. Smugglers thrived in the shadows. Along the North Sea coast, small craft slipped through fog and patrols, their holds packed with forbidden tea, tobacco, cotton, and newsprint. Hamburg's customs ledgers for 1808 record thousands of prosecutions, yet for every captured shipment, 10 more vanished into the night. British merchants rerouted trade through Sweden, Malta, and the Americas. The Royal Navy, master of the seas since Trafalgar, hovered just out of sight, ready to intercept or to protect as the tides demanded. French allies grumbled as warehouses filled with unsold goods and prices soared. Baltic ports, once bustling with commerce, fell silent. By 1810, the Hamburg registers showed trade had fallen by more than half. The iron ring Napoleon forged had begun to squeeze his own empire. Nowhere did the blockades cost bite deeper than in Iberia. Portugal, Britain's oldest ally, refused to comply. Napoleon sent an army to Lisbon in 1807, then marched into Spain. French troops occupied Madrid, but the occupation brought no peace. On June 5, 1808, in the market town of Valdepenas, villagers armed with knives and hunting muskets rose against the invaders. Parish records count 100 dead in a single day. Across the peninsula, ambushes and assassinations became daily rituals. French columns moved only with cavalry screens, their supply lines stretched and bleeding. The Peninsular War dragged on for 6 years, 60 battles, 30 sieges, A grinding struggle in villages and mountain passes. French losses mounted: 91,000 killed, 237,000 wounded. For every soldier struck down in battle, another fell to fever, to hunger, or to the knife of a guerrilla in the dark. The war consumed more than men. Requisitions stripped Spanish and Portuguese farms bare. Civilians fled to the hills or starved in the ruins of their homes. Letters from French officers preserved in the archives at Vincennes speak of an enemy that would not fight by rules. Bandits and priests, one wrote, who vanished before dawn, leaving only corpses behind. Yet the resistance would not end. British gold and Wellington's redcoats slipped ashore in Portugal, opening a second front that bled the Grande Armée of its best troops and its sense of invincibility. The strain of blockade and guerrilla war reached far beyond Europe. In the Caribbean, the dream of a restored French empire had already died. Napoleon's 1802 expedition to Saint-Domingue, 40,000 men under General Leclerc, had ended in disaster. Yellow fever and the relentless campaign of Jean-Jacques Dessalines left the French garrisons decimated. By January 1st, 1804, Dessalines proclaimed Haiti's independence. "We have dared to be free, let us dare to be free still." The French survivors limped home, their ranks broken. Their mission failed. The loss of Saint-Domingue made Louisiana, once a breadbasket for the Caribbean colonies, a liability. With no hope of defending it against Britain or local revolt, Napoleon sold the territory to the United States in 1803 for $15 million. One defeat in the tropics had doubled the size of a new republic across the Atlantic, and it closed the door on French imperial dreams in the Americas. The machinery of empire, so carefully constructed in Paris, groaned under the weight of its own ambitions. Decrees issued in Berlin and Milan, enforced by prefects and customs agents, could not seal the continent from British trade or from insurrection. In Spain and Portugal, the price of control was measured in blood and ash. Across the oceans, the loss of Haiti and the sale of Louisiana revealed the limits of power stretched too thin. The system that was meant to strangle an enemy instead bled the empire dry, and it foreshadowed new gambles and greater risks on the horizon. Before dawn on June 24, 1812, the banks of the Niemen River filled with the sound of boots, hooves, and the creak of wagons. 600,000 men, French, Poles, Italians, and Germans, crossed the water in silence, the largest army Europe had ever seen. Napoleon rode among them, his face drawn, eyes fixed on the eastern horizon. The Grande Armée stretched for miles, a living serpent of infantry, cavalry, and artillery, banners heavy with dew. The order was simple: invade Russia, force Tsar Alexander to heel, end British influence on the continent. It was a gamble on a scale even Bonaparte had never attempted. The first weeks brought only empty roads and burned villages. Russian troops fell back without fighting, torching crops and wells, leaving nothing for the invaders. In Vilnius, the French found deserted streets and empty granaries. Quartermasters counted rations by the day. Looting became routine. By mid-July, the army had already lost tens of thousands to hunger, disease, and desertion. Reports from the front grew grim. Marshal Davout wrote of men collapsing on the march, horses dying where they stood. The Russian summer, hot and thick with dust, offered no mercy. Still, the columns pressed on. By September, they neared the village of Borodino, a cluster of earthworks and redoubts on the road to Moscow. On September 7th, the two armies met in a storm of cannon fire and bayonet charges. The field churned with mud and blood as 250,000 men clashed for 12 hours. Napoleon watched from a low rise, his uniform spattered, his hands trembling from fever. He hesitated to commit his Imperial Guard, fearing a trap. By nightfall, the Russians withdrew, leaving 30,000 of their own dead behind. The French lost nearly as many. The ground was littered with shattered caissons, broken muskets, and the bodies of men and horses. It was victory, but nothing like Austerlitz. The enemy was not destroyed, only pushed back. A week later, on September 14th, the Grande Armée entered Moscow. The city was silent, its citizens gone. That night, flames erupted across the skyline. Fire consumed palaces, churches, and warehouses. Napoleon waited in the Kremlin, surrounded by smoke and the crackle of burning timber, convinced that Tsar Alexander would sue for peace. Days passed. No envoy arrived. Instead, the fires raged and supplies dwindled. Letters to Paris grew terse. The message read, "Moscow is empty." The men who had crossed the Niemen as conquerors now wandered the ruined streets in search of food and shelter. The air stank of ash and rot. Officers argued over dwindling rations, discipline frayed. Napoleon paced the halls of the Kremlin, his confidence eroding with each wasted day. The scale of his gamble, an army drawn from half of Europe, driven deep into a hostile land, now revealed its cost. The retreat would begin soon, and with it, the unravelling of everything the Grande Armée had built. Ice groaned under battered boots as the remnants of the Grande Armée staggered toward the Berezina. By late November 1812, temperatures plunged below -30. Men wrapped their hands in rags, shuffling past horses frozen in place. Quartermasters, once masters of order, scratched desperate numbers onto ruined manifests. The army that had crossed the Niemen 6 months before, over 500,000 strong, was now a gaunt, starving column. At the Berezina crossing, disaster pressed in. Russian forces under Chichagov and Wittgenstein closed from the west and north, their gunfire echoing across the ice. French engineers, led by General Ebel, worked waist-deep in freezing water, piecing together bridges from burnt timbers and wagon wheels. On November 26th, the first bridge stood. Soldiers surged forward, trampling the wounded as Russian shells tore through the crowd. Many were swept away by the current. The riverbank became a graveyard of shattered wagons and bodies locked in ice. Napoleon's carriage crossed in the chaos. Marshal Ney, face streaked with soot, rallied the rear guard. That night he wrote that they were all lost. Of the tens of thousands who reached the far side, few could still carry a musket. Official rolls preserved in the Service Historique de la Défense show that by the end of November, fewer than 30,000 effectives remained. Letters from the field, many undelivered, spoke of hunger so sharp men boiled leather for soup, of boots cut from corpses, of snow stained red for miles. The retreat from Russia shattered the illusion of imperial invincibility. News of the disaster raced across Europe. Prussian generals, once cowed, began plotting revolt. Austria hesitated, then turned against its former ally. In Paris, Napoleon tried to disguise the scale of the catastrophe, dictating bulletins about difficulties overcome. But the truth seeped out. The empire's backbone was broken. By April 6, 1814, the Allies, Russia, Prussia, Austria and Britain, closed in from every direction. French conscripts, many just boys, faced seasoned coalitions at Leipzig and then at the gates of Paris. Napoleon abdicated at Fontainebleau, surrounded by marshals worn down by defeat. The empire collapsed in weeks. Exile on Elbe followed, a small island for a man who had ruled half of Europe. On March 1, 1815, Napoleon landed in southern France. Old soldiers and peasants flocked to him. The Bourbon king fled Paris. The 100 Days began. A final, desperate gamble. Europe's response was swift. In Belgium, Wellington waited. On June 18, 1815, at Waterloo, rain turned fields to mud. French cavalry charged, but British infantry held. Late in the day, Blucher's Prussians struck the French right. The Imperial Guard advanced, then broke under musket fire. Panic spread. Napoleon fled as darkness fell. Wellington later called it the nearest run thing you ever saw in your life. On June 22, 1815, Napoleon abdicated again. The era came to an end in the mud of Waterloo, ambition drowned by ruin. In the shadow of defeat, the scaffolding of Napoleon's world did not collapse. Instead, its blueprints survived in ink and statute. In 1804, a thick volume landed on the desks of judges and notaries across France, the Code Civil des Français. Its pages, dense with articles and clauses, stripped away feudal privilege and patched together a new legal order. Property rights, secular marriage, equality before the law, each principle etched with the certainty of a general's command. The code did not stop at the borders of France. It crossed the Rhine, the Alps, and even the Pyrenees, carried by administrators and occupying armies. In Italy, the Netherlands, parts of Germany and Poland, courts began to cite its articles. The old patchwork of local customs gave way to a single, portable law. Even after Waterloo's mud had dried, the code remained. Monarchs who had fought Napoleon now found their own states reshaped by his statutes. The Congress of Vienna, convened in 1814 and 1815, tried to restore the balance of power. Diplomats redrew boundaries and revived old crowns, but the legal and administrative reforms proved harder to erase. The map of Europe was stitched together in Vienna's halls, yet everywhere the legacy of centralized administration and codified law lingered. The prefects, the prize courts, the language of equality before the law all survived the man who created them. Long after the cannons fell silent, the machinery of rule he built continued to hum across the continent, binding together nations that had once been enemies. Rows of names fill the conscription lists, each line a life folded into the ledger of war. From 1803 to 1815, France summoned nearly 2.5 million men to its armies, sons from Brittany, Alsace, the Pyrenees, and the distant provinces annexed in Napoleon's wake. Muster rolls in the Service historique de la Défense show entire villages emptied of young men. Some never marched home. Demographic studies estimate that between 3 and 6 million people died as the wars swept across Europe and beyond. The dead were not only soldiers. In Spain, parish registers record mothers and children lost to hunger after the harvests failed. In Russia, the winter of 1812 left fields sown with the bodies of men and horses alike. Letters from survivors preserved in faded ink speak of friends vanished on the road to Moscow, of fathers buried in unmarked graves along the Danube. For every victory inscribed in marble, there are thousands of names unspoken, written only in the margins of church books and town records. The cost was not measured in numbers alone. Across France, the rhythm of daily life broke under the weight of conscription and requisition. Empty cradles, abandoned farms, and silent workshops bore witness to a generation lost. In the occupied territories, civilians endured forced marches and the constant threat of violence. Petitions from Prussian and Italian towns, bundled in government archives, plead for relief from quartering and taxation. In the Caribbean, the restoration of slavery condemned entire populations to bondage once more. The machinery of empire, so efficient, so absolute, left scars that outlasted the regime itself. Progress and suffering advanced together, inseparable in the shadow of Napoleon's ambition. The ledger remains open, its balance unsettled, measured in lives as much as in laws. Borders still shift, and leaders still gamble millions on visions of order and glory. In Europe, more than 400 million people now live with treaties and legal codes shaped by Napoleon's wars. His shadow lingers in every debate over power, ambition, and the cost of empire. History does not repeat, but it never stops echoing. What we inherit is never just the map, it is the consequences. Share your thoughts below.